biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidant individuals after a breakup is the assumption that they simply do not care. People hear the words, "Can we still be friends?" and immediately interpret them as proof that the relationship meant very little. They think, if this person truly loved me, they would either fight for the relationship or let me go completely. But human psychology is rarely that simple. In many cases, the request to remain friends is not a sign that the connection was insignificant. Ironically, it can be evidence that the connection was deeply meaningful. The problem is that avoidants often experience emotional loss differently than other people do. They are not necessarily running away from their feelings. More often, they are running away from the intensity of those feelings. Think about what a breakup represents. For most people, it is not just the loss of a partner. It is the loss of a future, a routine, a source of comfort, a shared identity, and countless emotional investments. It forces a person to confront absence. It forces them to accept that someone who was once central to their life may no longer be there and do the same way. That reality can be painful for anyone, but for someone with avoidant tendencies, it creates a unique psychological conflict. On one hand, they crave distance because intimacy often triggers feelings of pressure, vulnerability, or emotional dependence. On the other hand, they still feel the pain of losing someone they genuinely care about. This creates an internal contradiction. They want freedom, but they do not want loss. They want space, but they do not want disconnection. They want relief from the demands of intimacy, while somehow preserving the emotional security the relationship provided. This is where friendship becomes psychologically attractive. Friendship offers a middle ground. It allows them to soften the impact of separation without fully confronting the finality of it. Instead of experiencing a complete emotional break, they maintain a thread of connection. They can still know that the other person exists in their world. They can still check in occasionally. They can still feel that the bond has not completely disappeared. From a psychological perspective, this functions as a form of emotional cushioning. It reduces the shock of loss. It delays the need to fully process grief. Rather than stepping into the uncertainty of complete separation, they create a bridge between what was and what is. Now, this does not necessarily mean they are consciously trying to manipulate anyone. In fact, many avoidants are not fully aware of why they are asking for friendship. They simply know that the idea of total disconnection feels uncomfortable. They may not understand that the discomfort they are experiencing is grief. They may label it as loneliness, guilt, confusion, or even concern for their former partner. But beneath all of those explanations is often a deeper reality. They are struggling with loss. And here is where things become particularly interesting. The avoidant individual often spends so much energy protecting themselves from emotional vulnerability that they never fully develop confidence in their ability to handle emotional pain. As a result, loss can feel overwhelming. Instead of moving directly through the grieving process, they instinctively seek ways to reduce its intensity. Remaining friends becomes one of those strategies. Philosophically, this reflects a very human tendency. Most people do not fear loss because they are weak. They fear loss because loss forces them to confront impermanence. It reminds them that nothing can be permanently possessed, not relationships, not experiences, not even versions of themselves. Avoidants are simply expressing this universal fear through a particular behavioral pattern. The tragedy is that what feels like protection can sometimes become postponement. The friendship may reduce immediate pain, but it can also delay genuine healing if it prevents both people from accepting reality. Growth begins when we stop negotiating with loss and start learning from it. Because the truth is simple. Sometimes the desire to stay friends is not about holding on to another person. It is about avoiding the experience of letting go. Once you understand that many avoidants ask to stay friends because they are struggling with the reality of emotional loss, the next question naturally becomes, why does friendship feel so comfortable to them after the breakup, especially when the relationship itself felt overwhelming? The answer lies in one of the deepest dynamics of avoidant psychology. Friendship allows them to maintain a sense of connection while dramatically reducing the level of emotional responsibility they feel. In other words, it gives them access to the benefits of connection without the pressures they associate with commitment. Now, this is important to understand because many people make the mistake of assuming that avoidants fear love itself. They do not. Most avoidants are perfectly capable of loving someone deeply. What they often fear is what love seems to require from them. They fear dependence. They fear expectations. They fear the loss of autonomy. They fear the feeling that another person's Emotional needs have become their responsibility. To someone with a secure attachment style, intimacy and freedom can coexist. They do not see commitment as a threat to their individuality. But avoidants often experience these two things as being in conflict. The closer the relationship becomes, the more they begin to feel that they are losing space, control, or independence. This creates a fascinating paradox. When they are emotionally distant from someone, they often long for connection. Yet when they achieve that connection and intimacy grows, discomfort begins to emerge. Suddenly, what once felt desirable starts to feel restrictive. What once felt exciting starts to feel demanding. After a breakup, friendship seems to solve this problem. Friendship creates a relationship structure where expectations are significantly lower. There is less pressure to constantly communicate. There is less obligation to discuss difficult emotions. There is less responsibility for another person's happiness. The emotional intensity that once activated their fears is reduced. From their perspective, this arrangement can feel ideal. They can still enjoy conversations. They can still feel emotionally connected. They can still receive validation and familiarity from someone they care about. Yet they no longer feel trapped by the expectations that came with the romantic relationship. What many people fail to recognize is that avoidants are often trying to regulate anxiety, not eliminate connection. The common stereotype is that avoidants want people out of their lives. But if that were true, they would not ask to stay friends. The reality is more complicated. They often want connection on terms that feel emotionally manageable. And this brings us to the issue of control. Human beings naturally seek environments where they feel psychologically safe. For avoidants, safety is often linked to control. The more unpredictable a situation feels, the more anxious they become. Romantic relationships require vulnerability, negotiation, compromise, and emotional exposure. All of these things involve uncertainty. Friendship, however, feels more predictable. There is greater freedom to engage when they want and withdraw when they need space. They can determine the level of emotional involvement. They can control the pace of interaction. Most importantly, they can maintain a sense of independence while still keeping the relationship alive. This does not necessarily mean they are being selfish. In many cases, they genuinely believe friendship is the healthiest option available. They may think they are preserving something valuable rather than destroying it. But there is an important philosophical lesson here. Control often creates the illusion of safety. We believe that if we can carefully manage our exposure to risk, we can protect ourselves from pain. Yet the greatest experiences in life rarely emerge from control. They emerge from participation. Love, trust, intimacy, and growth all require a willingness to step into uncertainty. The avoidant individual often finds themselves caught between these two realities. One part of them desires connection. Another part seeks protection. Friendship after a breakup becomes the compromise between those competing needs. The challenge is that compromise is not always transformation. A person can maintain control and avoid discomfort for years without ever confronting the fears that created the discomfort in the first place. Real growth begins when someone becomes willing to examine the beliefs underneath their need for control. What are they protecting themselves from? What do they believe will happen if they fully open up? What part of themselves are they afraid another person might see? Those are the questions that lead to change. Because at the deepest level, friendship after a breakup is often not about connection versus separation. It is about certainty versus vulnerability. And until vulnerability no longer feels dangerous, control will always seem safer than love. The greatest prison is not commitment, it is the fear that makes commitment feel threatening. As we go deeper into understanding why avoidants often ask to stay friends after a breakup, we arrive at a motivation that is rarely discussed but incredibly important. It has less to do with love, commitment, or even fear of intimacy, and more to do with something fundamental to human nature, the desire to see ourselves as good people. Most people want to believe they are caring, compassionate, and morally responsible. We all carry an internal image of who we think we are. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the self-concept. It is the story we tell ourselves about our character, our intentions, and our place in the world. The challenge is that breakups can threaten that story. When a relationship ends, especially if one person initiates the breakup, there is often an unavoidable reality. Someone is going to get hurt. Even if the decision is necessary, even if the relationship is no longer healthy, the act of leaving can create pain for another human being. And for many avoidants, this creates a significant internal conflict. On one side, they feel compelled to create distance because the relationship has become emotionally overwhelming. On the other side, they do not want to see themselves as someone who causes suffering. They want freedom, but they do not want guilt. This is where the offer of friendship can become psychologically meaningful. By suggesting friendship, they create a narrative in which they are not completely abandoning the other person. They can tell themselves, consciously or unconsciously, I'm still here. I still care. I haven't disappeared. I'm not being cruel. Notice how different that feels emotionally from saying, I no longer want contact with you. For many avoidants, the first option protects their self-image. The second forces them to confront feelings they would rather avoid. Now, this does not mean the friendship offer is dishonest. In many cases, they genuinely do care about their former partner. They may sincerely want to remain connected, but it is important to recognize that their own emotional comfort can also be part of the time. Human beings have a remarkable ability to create solutions that simultaneously address multiple needs. The friendship proposal often serves two purposes at once. It allows them to maintain some form of connection while also reducing the psychological burden of feeling responsible for another person's pain. In psychology, there is a concept known as cognitive dissonance. This occurs when two beliefs or realities clash with one another. Imagine someone who sees themselves as loving and compassionate, but has made a decision that deeply hurts someone they care about. Those two realities can create emotional tension. One way to resolve that tension is through friendship. If they remain friends, they no longer have to view themselves as someone who completely walked away. The friendship becomes evidence that they are still caring, still supportive, still involved in some capacity. But there is a deeper philosophical layer to this. Many people spend their lives trying to avoid guilt. They believe guilt is proof that they have failed or done something wrong. Yet guilt is often far more complicated than that. Sometimes guilt emerges not because we are bad people, but because we are facing a painful truth. Every meaningful choice involves sacrifice. When someone ends a relationship, there is no perfect outcome. Staying may create suffering. Leaving may create suffering. Someone's heart may break regardless of the decision. Mature emotional development requires accepting that reality. The avoidant individual, however, often struggles with emotionally uncomfortable experiences. Just as they may avoid vulnerability, they may also avoid guilt. Friendship can become a way of softening that emotional burden. It creates the feeling that the ending is less severe, less final, less painful. The irony is that trying to avoid guilt can sometimes create even more confusion. A former partner may interpret friendship as hope. They may believe reconciliation is possible. They may remain emotionally attached, while the avoidant has already mentally moved on. What began as an attempt to reduce pain can unintentionally prolong it. This is why emotional honesty matters so much. Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is not the thing that makes them feel most comfortable. Sometimes compassion requires tolerating discomfort. Sometimes caring for another person means being clear rather than being reassuring. And that lesson extends far beyond relationships. One of the marks of emotional maturity is the willingness to accept that being a good person does not mean avoiding every difficult emotion. It means acting with integrity even when those emotions arise. It means understanding that guilt, sadness, and regret are not enemies to escape from, but experiences to learn from. Because in the end, true compassion is not measured by how successfully we protect our self-image. It is measured by how courageously we face the consequences of our choices. And sometimes the most honest act of kindness is not holding on. It is having the courage to let go completely. At this point, we need to address one of the most persistent myths surrounding avoidant individuals. It is the belief that if they leave a relationship, pull away emotionally, or ask to remain friends after a breakup, then they must not have loved the other person very much. For many people who have been on the receiving end of an avoidance withdrawal, this conclusion feels obvious. After all, if someone truly loved you, why would they create distance? Why would they walk away from the relationship? Why would they choose friendship over romance? But psychology tells us something very different. The absence of closeness is not always the absence of love. In fact, one of the most painful realities for many avoidants is that they often experience genuine love and genuine fear at the same time. The problem is not necessarily that they lack feelings. The problem is that those feelings activate psychological threats that they do not fully know how to manage. This is where many people misunderstand avoidant attachment. They assume avoidance is a lack of emotional depth when, in reality, it is often a strategy for managing emotional intensity. Think about it this way. Most people imagine love as something that naturally brings comfort, security, and happiness. and at its best it does. But love also creates vulnerability. The moment you deeply care about someone, you become capable of losing them. The moment another person matters, they gain the power to affect you emotionally. Their approval matters. Their rejection matters. Their presence matters. For someone with secure emotional foundations, this vulnerability feels like a natural part of connection. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, vulnerability can feel dangerous. The deeper the connection becomes, the greater the perceived risk. Suddenly, intimacy is no longer just intimacy. It begins to feel like dependence. Emotional closeness starts to feel like a loss of freedom. Commitment starts to feel like an obligation they may not be able to fulfill. The relationship becomes associated with pressure rather than safety. This creates an internal battle that many avoidants never fully understand themselves. One part of them wants connection. Another part wants protection. One part longs to be seen, understood, and loved. Another part fears the consequences of needing someone that deeply. As a result, when intimacy reaches a certain level, the nervous system often reacts as though there is a threat present. Not a physical threat, but an emotional one. Distance becomes a coping mechanism. Withdrawal becomes a way to regulate anxiety. Creating space feels like regaining control. What is important to understand is that this process can occur while love is still present. An avoidant can miss someone and still avoid them. They can care deeply and still create distance. They can think about a former partner constantly while convincing themselves that separation is necessary. This contradiction is difficult for many people to comprehend because it challenges the common assumption that human behavior always reflects human feelings. In reality, behavior often reflects what a person is trying to protect themselves from. And this brings us back to friendship after a breakup. For many avoidants, friendship feels safer because it preserves emotional connection while reducing emotional exposure. The affection may still be there. The care may still be there. The concern may still be there. But the level of vulnerability required by a romantic relationship is significantly lower. In their mind, this feels like a solution. They can remain connected without confronting the fears that intimacy activates. They can maintain the bond without feeling consumed by it. They can care without feeling dependent. The tragedy is that this solution often addresses the symptom rather than the cause. Because the real issue was never love itself. The real issue was the meaning attached to love. If someone unconsciously believes that intimacy will lead to loss of freedom, emotional engulfment, rejection, disappointment, or pain, then every increase in closeness will trigger resistance. No amount of affection can fully overcome a fear that remains unexamined. This is why growth requires more than understanding feelings. It requires understanding fears. Love alone does not heal avoidance. Awareness does. The avoidant who begins to recognize these hidden fears gains the opportunity to challenge them. They can learn that dependence is not weakness. They can learn that vulnerability is not danger. They can learn that closeness and freedom are not opposites. And perhaps most importantly, they can learn that intimacy is not something that takes away who they are. It is something that allows them to share who they are. Because the greatest obstacle to love is rarely the absence of feeling. More often, it is the presence of fear. And when fear becomes stronger than vulnerability, people run from the very connection they secretly wish they could keep. Once we understand that avoidants often continue to care after a breakup, and that friendship can feel safer than romantic intimacy, another important piece of the puzzle begins to emerge. Sometimes the request to stay friends is not only about managing loss, reducing guilt, or avoiding vulnerability. Sometimes it is also about uncertainty. One of the most overlooked aspects of avoidant psychology is that avoidants are not always as certain about their decisions as they appear. From the outside, they can seem decisive. They end the relationship. They create distance. They insist they need space. Their actions may look clear and intentional, but internally, the experience is often far more complicated. Many avoidants leave relationships because they are trying to escape discomfort, not because they have fully resolved their feelings. That distinction matters. When someone ends a relationship because they no longer care, their path forward is usually straightforward. Their emotional investment has already diminished. Their decision aligns with their feelings. But when someone ends a relationship because intimacy itself has become overwhelming, the situation becomes much more complex. The relationship may have ended, yet the feelings remain. The connection may have been meaningful, yet the fear was stronger. The person may be gone, yet the emotional attachment has not completely disappeared. As a result, many avoidants find themselves in a state of psychological ambivalence. Part of them believes leaving was necessary. Another part wonders whether they made a mistake. And this is where friendship can serve a very specific psychological function. It allows them to preserve options, not necessarily in a manipulative way, not necessarily as a conscious strategy, but on a deeper level. Friendship can become a way of keeping the door slightly open while avoiding the responsibilities of walking back through it. Human beings generally dislike irreversible decisions. We feel more comfortable when alternatives remain available. Economists call this option value, the tendency to preserve future possibilities because uncertainty makes commitment feel risky. Avoidants are often especially sensitive to this dynamic because certainty is rarely present in their emotional world. They may feel relief after a breakup, only to experience longing weeks later. They may enjoy their independence, only to miss the emotional connection they left behind. They may convince themselves that distance was necessary, only to question that conclusion once the immediate pressure of intimacy disappears. This creates a cycle that many former partners find confusing. The avoidant asks for space. Then they reach out. They seem distant. Then they seem nostalgic. They pull away. Then they reconnect. What is happening is not always a lack of sincerity. Often it is the collision of competing emotional needs. One part seeks freedom. Another seeks attachment. One part values independence. Another fears losing someone important forever. Friendship becomes the compromise between those competing forces. By remaining friends, they do not have to fully commit to either direction. They do not have to fully let go, but they also do not have to fully return. Psychologically, this can feel reassuring. It reduces the anxiety associated with permanent loss. It creates the comforting belief that if circumstances change, if emotions shift, if clarity arrives later, the connection is still there. Yet this is where an important philosophical truth emerges. Life rarely moves forward through open doors. Growth often requires closed ones. Many of the most transformative moments in life occur when we accept that uncertainty cannot be eliminated. At some point, every meaningful decision demands courage, not certainty. Courage. The problem with keeping every possibility alive is that it can prevent us from fully inhabiting the reality we are currently living. When an avoidant keeps the door slightly open, they may avoid immediate regret, but they may also avoid the deeper process of confronting their fears, understanding their choices, and growing from the experience. Likewise, the former partner may remain emotionally suspended between hope and acceptance. Instead of grieving the relationship, they continue waiting for a future that may never arrive. This is why clarity is so valuable. Clarity does not always feel good, but it creates movement. Ambiguity often feels safer because it protects us from finality. Yet ambiguity can quietly become its own form of emotional captivity. The deeper lesson here extends beyond relationships. Many people spend years standing in doorways. They do not fully leave. They do not fully stay. They remain attached to possibilities, because possibilities feel safer than decisions. But a possibility can never transform your life. Only a commitment can. Whether that commitment is to rebuilding a relationship or accepting its end, real growth begins when we stop negotiating with uncertainty and start embracing reality. Because keeping the door open may protect you from loss today, but it can also keep you from discovering what awaits on the other side tomorrow. As we bring all of these ideas together, a larger picture begins to emerge. We have talked about how avoidants often ask to stay friends because they are struggling with loss. We have explored how friendship allows them to maintain connection without the pressure of commitment. We have examined guilt, uncertainty, and the possibility that genuine feelings may still exist beneath the distance. But if you strip away all of these layers and ask what sits at the center of the pattern, you arrive at a surprisingly simple answer: fear. Not necessarily fear in the dramatic sense that most people imagine. Not panic, not terror, but a quieter, deeper form of fear that shapes perception, behavior, and relationships from behind the scenes. This is one of the most important insights anyone can understand about avoidant attachment. The behaviors people see are often reactions to fears they do not see. When an avoidant pulls away, people assume they do not care. When they ask for friendship, people assume they want convenience. When they create distance, people assume they are emotionally detached. Yet beneath many of these behaviors is a nervous system attempting to protect itself from experiences it has learned to associate with danger. The fear may be different from person to person. For some, it is the fear of vulnerability. For others, it is the fear of dependence. For others, it is the fear of rejection, abandonment, disappointment, failure, or losing control. But regardless of the specific form it takes, the underlying dynamic is remarkably similar. The mind becomes convinced that emotional closeness carries a threat, and once that belief is established, relationships become confusing. The very thing a person wants becomes the thing they fear. The very connection they crave becomes the source of anxiety. The very intimacy that could heal them begins to feel dangerous. This is why understanding avoidant behavior requires looking beyond actions and into motivations. Human beings are often far more influenced by what they fear than by what they desire. Think about how many decisions people make not because they are pursuing something meaningful, but because they are trying to avoid discomfort. They stay silent to avoid criticism. They avoid opportunities to avoid failure. They hold back emotionally to avoid rejection. The avoidant individual is often doing something similar within relationships. The friendship request after a breakup is frequently an attempt to solve an impossible equation. They want connection without vulnerability. They want closeness without dependence. They want emotional safety without emotional exposure. The challenge, of course, is that no such equation exists. Every meaningful human relationship requires risk. There is no version of love that guarantees safety. There is no form of intimacy that eliminates uncertainty. There is no connection that comes with absolute protection from pain. And this is not a flaw in relationships. It is the price of everything valuable. Philosophically speaking, fear becomes destructive when it begins organizing a person's life. Fear is useful when it provides information. It becomes limiting when it becomes the decision maker. The avoidant who is driven primarily by fear may believe they are protecting themselves. In reality, they are often sacrificing experiences that would allow them to grow. Because growth never occurs inside emotional fortresses. Growth occurs at the edge of vulnerability. It occurs when a person becomes willing to experience uncertainty without immediately escaping it. It occurs when they discover that discomfort is survivable. It occurs when they learn that needing someone does not erase their independence, and that closeness does not automatically lead to loss of self. This understanding is important not only for avoidants, but also for those who have loved them. Many people spend years trying to decode avoidant behavior. They analyze every text message, every mixed signal, every moment of distance. They search for hidden meanings in actions that often appear contradictory. But sometimes the most accurate explanation is also the simplest. Fear creates contradiction. Fear says, come closer. Then it says, not too close. Fear says, I need you. Then it says, I don't want to need anyone. Fear says, stay. Then it whispers, run. When you recognize this dynamic, something powerful happens. You stop viewing avoidant behavior as evidence of a lack of feeling. Instead, you begin seeing it as evidence of an unresolved relationship with vulnerability itself. And that realization changes everything. Because healing does not begin when fear disappears. Healing begins when fear is no longer allowed to dictate every choice. The greatest transformation in any relationship occurs the moment a person chooses courage over protection, vulnerability over avoidance, and truth over fear. Because in the end, the opposite of fear is not confidence. It is the willingness to stay open when every instinct tells you to close. So when an avoidant asks to stay friends after a breakup, the real question is not, do they care? More often the question is, what are they afraid of? Throughout this conversation, we've seen that friendship can serve many purposes. It can soften the pain of loss. It can provide connection without commitment. It can reduce guilt, preserve options, and create a sense of emotional safety. But beneath all of these reasons lies a common thread: the desire to remain connected while avoiding the vulnerability that true intimacy requires. And that is ultimately the human struggle, not just the avoidance struggle. Every one of us faces moments when life asks us to choose between protection and growth, between certainty and possibility, between the safety of our defenses and the risk of opening our hearts. The difference is that some people build their lives around avoiding pain, while others learn to move through it. The truth is that love has never been about eliminating fear. Love is about developing the courage to act despite it. If you're someone who has loved an avoidant, remember this: their distance is not always a measure of your worth. Often, it is a reflection of an internal battle you were never responsible for solving. And if you recognize avoidant tendencies within yourself, understand that the path forward is not found in running from vulnerability, but in learning that vulnerability itself is not the enemy. Because the deepest connections in life are not built by people who never feel fear. They are built by people who refuse to let fear make their decisions. In the end, asking to stay friends may keep a connection alive for a while, but only courage can create the intimacy that human beings are truly searching for. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: The quality of your relationships will never rise above the fears you are unwilling to face.